Okay. The lesson we're on in your book is November the 25th, 2018. It's lesson 15. Next week, Don will be back with you for a few lessons, and I'll come back at the last one, which deals with Revelation. That's on December the 23rd. I'm not sure where we're jumping next. I think it's some lessons that David Eversall's put together on giving. But I would also remind you that the baskets will be passed around twice today. We did this last week, okay? We have our regular offering and missions basket that will come around, and then we'll do it as, the big basket. The big basket. So the big basket will be our special offering, which if you remember, we signed up to provide Christmas for 10 children at Boones Creek Elementary, if I remember correctly. Okay, so we have 10 of those that we're going to be buying for or shopping for. So that's what the special offering is for. If you gave last week, you can give again this week. If you didn't give last week, you can double it up. Okay? So you got this is our second opportunity and final opportunity to do that. And today we're going to be looking at the Apostle Paul, essentially. Because what we're going to jump to next, we've looked at the book of Acts. Okay? Today we're going to look at the Apostle Paul, his life, some of his writings, some things about Paul. And then we'll start jumping into the letters or the epistles that he wrote. Okay? Now what I provided for you, we really won't refer to this today, but this is just a chronology, if you would, of the life of Paul with different dates in his life and also historical events that were taking place simultaneously. And I've never really seen it laid out something like this before. But this is, just a compilation of what most scholars think Paul's life, if you look at it in a timeline form, what it would have been like. Okay? So I'll just give you that for your reference there as we talk today. And so let's just go ahead and jump in and look at our lesson here. We're up at the top of the page and it says, the New Testament can roughly be organized into three parts. The first part is the first four books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which we call the Gospels, and then the book of Acts, which is the Acts of the Apostles. It's the early church. It mainly records the travels of Peter and Paul, along with some others in there. And we talked about that the last week. Then there's a section which is made up of 21 books in our Bible, which we call the letters, or the epistles. And these go from, I've got them listed out right over here for you. These go from Romans all the way to Jude. Okay? We'll talk about what those stars up there mean in just a moment. But that's our 21 books that we find in the New Testament. And then the last one is a prophecy book, if you would, an apocalypse book, which we call Revelation. Okay? And that's the only book of prophecy that we have in the New Testament. The Old Testament has many. But the New Testament, this is the only book of prophecy that we have, written by John. So the bulk of our New Testament is made up of letters that were predominantly written by one person, and that being the Apostle Paul. And that's what this green line represents. Paul wrote the books in our Bible from Romans to Philemon, okay? And then we have some others that we'll talk about later that are also in there as letters or epistles, written to a specific group or specific person. Okay, you coming on down? It says of the 27 books in the New Testament, 13 are written by one man, and that being Paul. Before we look at Paul's letters, it's important to first take a look at his life, is the word that we're after there in that blank. And that's what we're going to do here in just a few minutes. It says to understand and interpret Paul's letters, they cannot be divorced from the context in which they were written. And I remember we had some lessons this summer in our small group out of Peter. And one of the things that David always encouraged us to do and always shared with us was the context in which the letter was written. Because if you start taking things out of the context in which they were written, you can get a whole different meaning out of it than what the writer ever intended. Okay? So it's always important when you look at any of these writings of Paul that you understand the context in which they were written. Who were they written to? Why was he writing it? That type of thing. All right? And we come down to the short background of Paul, and we're going to look briefly at Paul's life before Christ. It says, Paul was born in the Greek city of Tarsus in what is today southeastern Turkey. Now, a couple of things about Tarsus. It was the capital of Cilicia. That's Cilicia. Cilicia was the capital. This was a free city, and the city also had no taxes, which was kind of unusual for a city under the jurisdiction of Rome. And I read somewhere that Mark Antony was the Roman emperor that allowed the taxes to be lifted from this particular city. Also, I read something from the Roman scholar named Jerome. He was a Greek historian, kind of like Josephus. He says some scholars think that Paul's parents came to Tarsus as prisoners of war between 5 BC and 5 AD. Now, whether that's true or not, I can't say for sure. It's just that some scholars think that's how Jews, because that's what they were, ended up in Tarsus. Okay? They could have been prisoners of war and were taken there. It says, his mother was Jewish and his father was a Roman, is the word we're looking for, citizen, which made Paul a Roman citizen. And remember, Paul, we read in Acts, used that kind of as a trump card, didn't he? To get his way all the way up to see Caesar when he was falsely accused of something. Now, a couple of things about Roman citizenship. Once again, this is not in our book here. First of all, we have to understand that Roman citizenship was not automatic. Okay? It was not. You could either be born into it, as Paul was, and that was because he was from a city that was under Roman rule. Or you could buy your way into it. Remember the story of the centurion that Paul was talking to when he was in jail? He said, how much did you pay for your citizenship? And Paul said, I didn't pay anything. I was born into it, essentially. So Roman citizenship was not automatic, okay? And it was Caesar Augustus that actually made this area of Cilicia part of the Roman Empire, if you would. Okay? Number 2, in his early youth, Paul was sent to Jerusalem to become a student of Jewish laws. His teacher, Gamaliel, was a very famous rabbi. And we can read more about that in Acts 22:3. It tells us there. Okay? Now, we know that Paul was partially educated in Tarsus because of the fact that he could read Greek and he could also write Greek. And the Greek, we've mentioned this before in the past, that he wrote and was able to write in was Koine Greek, just basically street Greek is what it's called. Not the formal Greek, but just basically street Greek. Everybody in the Roman Empire basically used that as their common language, if you remember. So it was very appropriate for him to do that. We also know, as we mentioned here, that he studied in Jerusalem. Now, a few things about Gamaliel, okay? We know, first of all, that he was a Pharisee. We know, second of all, that he was a very famous teacher, as we're told here. We also know from other historical sources that he studied Greek literature as well as Hebrew literature, which was very unusual for a rabbi or a Jewish teacher to do, okay? We also know that he had a tolerant attitude. If we go back to Acts chapter 5, verse 34, you can read about him basically telling the Sanhedrin, the rulers of the Jews, if you would, not to do anything to stifle this movement. Okay? Because if you do, you're fighting against God, essentially. So we know he was tolerant. We also know that he tried to make Sabbath observances less rigorous. In other words, the Jews had all these laws about how you were to keep the Sabbath. No one could really do that perfectly, so he was striving to make those less rigorous. And another thing that we know about him was that he urged kindness towards Gentiles. Once again, unusual for the Jews because Gentiles were basically a hated or a despised group. Okay? All right, going down to number 3. At some point in his life, Paul also learned the trade of tent making. Every Jewish rabbi was expected to learn a practical trade. That's interesting. So every Jewish rabbi had to have something to do besides preaching or teaching about the Old Testament in this case. Okay? Number 4, Paul was a zealous Jew, eager to live according to the strict moral laws. When the church came into existence, Paul was quick to begin persecution of what he saw as a perversion. The word we're looking for is perversion of the Jewish faith. Stephen was the first Christian martyr put to death for his faith, and his execution was under the approval and direction of Paul. And it tells us you can read more about that in Acts chapter 8. Okay, verse 1. Number 5. On his way to persecuting the Christians at Damascus, Paul was struck blind by Jesus, who asked, "Why do you persecute me?" This event was so important to Paul's life that Luke mentions it 3 times in the book of Acts. And Justin provides those 3 references to this event. So that was the life-changing moment in Paul's life, wasn't it? That's the one that kind of turned him around and made him basically an apostle. That's what that basically did. Okay? Now, number 6. After his conversion, Paul began to preach the gospel of Jesus boldly, is the word we're looking for, to non-believers. So he turned from somebody that was persecuting the church boldly to someone who was preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ boldly. And that's a 180-degree turn when you stop and think about it. 180 degrees. Okay? Number 7. In summary, it is important to understand Paul as, number 1, a Roman citizen. He was familiar with Hellenistic language, that's Greek, culture, and government. He made several appeals to his citizenship during his journeys. Pharisee, Jewish sect which emphasized the obedience to Jewish law. And then C, an apostle of Jesus. The death and resurrection of Jesus forced Paul to reinterpret his vast understanding of the Old Testament. Okay? So Paul was a very qualified, the point that is being tried to be made here, Paul was a very qualified individual to do the job that God called him to do on the road to Damascus. Probably the most qualified. Because he knew all about Jewish law, so he could go into any synagogue and argue with anybody about that. But he also knew about the gospel of Jesus Christ. Okay? Now, I put a question in here. Was Paul married? You know, there's a lot of different opinion on whether Paul was married or not. Some scholars would say yes, because they would go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 5, where Paul talks about the right of a missionary to take their spouse, in this case their wife, with them on a missionary journey. And once again, that's in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 5. But then on the other hand, when you go to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 through 7, he talks about being celibate. He says, I encourage you to be celibate as I am. But I think the most telling one is 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7, where he talks about the thorn in the flesh. So I'm thinking he may have been married based on that verse. I apologize to the visitors. So was Paul married? The point is, we don't know. I mean, he could have been. He never writes about it directly anywhere in any of his books. He never talks about it. Okay? I'll be glad to. Go to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 5. And that's a serious one. Okay? And I don't ever remember reading that before. I mean, I know I have, but he talks about the right that a missionary has to take their wife with them when they travel. I mean, that's what that one verse says, essentially. And then 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 through 7. That's where he turns around and talks about being celibate and single. Okay? So those two give you the mixed feelings. Was he or wasn't he? We just really don't know. We do know this, okay? Paul was not a member of the Sanhedrin, because if he was, you have to be married. If you want to be a member of the Sanhedrin, you have to be married. Rabbis don't. Okay? But if a rabbi becomes a member of the Sanhedrin, then you have to be married. Okay? So we know he was a Pharisee. We know he was a rabbi. We know that. Okay? But we don't know that he was a member of the Sanhedrin. We don't know that. Okay? Let's go down to the next section, Apostle Paul. It says most of Paul's life as an apostle was spent traveling, is the word we're looking for, traveling great distances to preach the gospel. We talked about that last week, didn't we? Paul traveled in his lifetime over 10,000 miles. And that's in the journeys we know about. You know, some tradition says that he was killed in Rome under the rule of Nero. Other tradition says he made it all the way to Spain, which was called Gaul at the time. But we don't know that for sure. Okay, we don't know. That's what he wanted to do. But we don't know for sure that he made it that far. But in any case, the known missionary journeys mounted up to about 10,000 miles. Now think about that. Okay, 10,000 miles. After his conversion, his life consisted mostly of 3 missionary journeys and a trip to Rome as a prisoner, which we talked about last week, once again. Okay? Number 2, Paul started many churches, but did not stay at any one church for a long period of time. Although he tried to visit, that's the word we're looking for, visit them as often as he could, it wasn't enough. The churches had many questions and problems. Number 3, thus, as Paul traveled the world preaching, he also wrote many letters to the churches to encourage and instruct. Encourage and instruct. Okay, number 4. The letters of Paul that survived were collected and are in the New Testament. And these are referred to as the Pauline epistles. The Pauline epistles. And I've listed them right up here for you. Okay? Slide right over here if I can. They're right here. They go from Romans all the way down to Philemon. Now, you'll notice that I've marked some of those for you. Okay? And you can do this in your book as well. First of all, the ones that are in with the blue stars, okay, those are referred to as the prison epistles. So what we've got there is basically Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. Those were written while Paul was in that 2 years of prison under house arrest. And we can read about that in Acts 28, 30 through 31. So that's when those were written, was during that time period. And once again, that's Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. Those are called the prison epistles. Altogether, they're called the Pauline epistles. Okay? Then, when we look at 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, okay, those are referred to as the pastoral epistles. The pastoral epistles. And those were written to pastors and leaders of the early church. Okay? And it's just basically their names. We all remember Timothy, right? Okay? Titus was another one. Those were young men that Paul had recruited on his journeys to kind of take his place, if you would, when he couldn't be there in the early churches. And most of those writings deal with church practices, is what they deal with. You know, what's the role of an elder? What's the role of a deacon? How does a minister conduct himself? A lot of doctrine and that type of thing are buried in those passages. And we still use that today to guide us as a Christian church. Okay? So that same advice is used today. The others, that would be Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Galatians, were basically letters or epistles that were written to churches. That's what those basically were. Okay? B. His letters are arranged roughly by size, from smallest to largest, in our Bible. And chronologically, his letters were probably written in the following order. And it gives you the order there, okay, that they were written in. Now, the other epistles, which are down here, that's Hebrews, James, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, 1st and 2nd Peter, and Jude, make up those other 21 letters or epistles that we talked about in the New Testament. Okay? And those are usually referred to as the general or Catholic epistles. Catholic, folks, just means universal. That's all it means. So when you say Catholic Church, it just really means universal church. That's all it means. So these are called general or universal because they weren't written necessarily to a specific person, a specific church, or a specific group. All right? And one of the earliest New Testament writers was James right here. That's a half-brother of Jesus. And then Jude, I think that's the shortest one if I remember right. That was another half-brother of Jesus. And of course you got Peter and you got John. And we don't really know who wrote Hebrews. I tend to think it's Paul, just based on, how much Jewish and Christian teaching is in that particular book. And I think to myself, who would have been the most qualified to write it? But we really don't know. Because most letters and epistles, the writer of it, the first thing they do is always give their name. They always do. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. They always give their name. And they give who it's written to. That's not the case with this one. There is no writer named for it. So we really don't know who wrote that particular epistle or book. Okay? All right, coming down to the next section, the ancient letter. Paul's writings aren't technically letters, which is interesting. That's what we call them, but they're not technically letters. They belong to a genre or type of literature called an epistle. And then they go on to give you the difference there. A letter is usually private communication and it's written to one person in particular. An epistle is public communication. It's more official, carries more weight, has more authority, and it's usually written to a group. So while we call them letters, I know, in older Bibles especially, you'll see the word epistle at the top of or the title of each of these books anyway. That's the more proper term for it. It's more of an official, public communication written to a specific group. All right, come on over to the next page. Some characteristics of these letters or epistles. Epistles were common in the ancient world. In other words, it wasn't special or significant just to the Bible. These were common ways of writing things in the ancient world. They were generally written by a scribe or let's see if I can say this right, a manuensis. Okay? That's close. The author would normally dictate the letter to a scribe who would write it down. Why? The scribe had better handwriting. That's why. They're professional handwriters. So the scribe had better handwriting. It was easier to read, that type of thing. Okay? The process usually wasn't word for word. Rather, the scribe took notes and wrote out the actual text at a later time. We still see that today, don't we? We call them court reporters. They're sitting there with that little typewriter or a computer doing shorthand, which is a bunch of symbols that don't mean a thing to me. Then they go back and write it out later. Medical transcription. Isn't that what happened? You take the doctor's notes, which are probably very difficult to read, and then somebody else transcribes them and puts them in the computer. Okay? We still see that. So that's the scribe. They took notes is what they basically did. If the author was intending for his work to be circulated, this is section B, circulated to many groups, as Paul certainly was, he would carefully review the final product. So the scribe takes notes, the scribe goes and then writes everything down, brings it back to the author, and the author says, yeah, that's okay. Okay, they have to proof it, in other words. Then it gets sent out, circulated. Number 2, the term epistle is used to describe a body of literature that fits into a similar form, is the word, and structure. Aside from lengthening his epistles, Paul wrote them according to the same rules as his contemporaries. And this is letter A. Name of the writer and recipient. That was the first thing you put in an epistle. The name of the recipient and who wrote it. That's the first thing. Okay? And they give you an example down there from Romans 1, verses 1 and 7. Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle and set apart for the gospel of God, to all in Rome who are loved by God and called to be his saints. There you go. Tells you who wrote it and who they're writing to. B, greeting. Some greeting wishing peace for the recipient. So B, the word is greeting. And once again, we're given an example of that. C, polite expression of thanks for the good health for the recipient. Paul expanded this to give thanks to God. And they give you an example in Romans 1:8. First, I think my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is being reported all over the world. Then letter D, main body of the letter or the epistle. Paul's epistles are considerably longer than their ancient counterparts. E was personal news about the author. And they give you an example of that. And then F, exhortation or blessing. Once again, there's an example provided. And ends with a word of farewell, which Paul usually expanded to a prayer. So when you look at Paul's epistles, his letters, you can look at it in that breakdown, that format. That's the way he did every one of them. That's kind of what sets Hebrews apart. It's not like that. The author's not named, for one thing. Okay? So it's not laid out the same way. All right, coming over to the next page. It says, reading the epistles. There are a few things to keep in mind when reading Paul's epistles. Letter A. They were written to encourage and instruct believers at the churches he started. That was his purpose. Since he couldn't go back, you have questions, I will try to answer those for you. Okay? B. They were read publicly. Okay? So this wasn't just something that was passed around from person to person. They were probably read in those early churches. And were meant to be circulated to the surrounding churches, even though they were addressed to an individual. So just because a letter made it to the Corinthian church doesn't mean a church in Rome didn't get a hold of it at some point and read it. Does that make sense? So they were circulated around to different churches and individuals. C. They were written to a specific audience and thus addressed specific situations. Specific situations. Because if I remember correctly, a lot of his letters were written to correct and instruct, weren't they? But then a few of them were written to encourage. You're doing a good job. Keep it up. Okay? Letter I. Reading the epistle is like listening to one side of a phone conversation. Most of the conversation would be easy to understand, but some would be difficult because we can't hear what the other person is saying, is what goes in that blank, saying. To add to the difficulties, we don't know what knowledge both sides share. So it's like we're listening to one side of a conversation. The Corinthians had different problems and questions than the Thessalonians, and thus Paul wrote different letters to each group. Because each epistle came out of a specific location, Paul had a specific purpose for each of his writings. There is a very close relationship between occasion and purpose. In other words, the situation under which the letter is written and the purpose for which it's written. Okay? The next part, it says occasion. And all I did there, you can read it for yourself. I just added, there's always a good reason that an epistle is written. These letters that we have here were not written for no reason. There's always a good reason why Paul wrote these letters or epistles. Okay, coming down to the purpose. It says the main points the author seeks to communicate in his writings will be our purpose. And number one, the epistles are not theological textbooks. Even Paul's greatest epistle, Romans, is not a textbook of systematic theology. So it's not designed to be a textbook. It's designed to be a letter written to instruct this particular group in Rome. 2, Paul always made a close connection between the theology of Christ and moral, ethical regulations for the believers. So it says connection. And then we're given some examples of that down below. Okay? One of Paul's greatest theological struggles was centered on the concepts of grace and law. That was a struggle. It was always grace and law. And then he would have a definition for grace down below as God's free gift of salvation, and the law, God's perfect commandments for His people. Okay? And then down below it says, how did Jesus respond to this? They saw Paul as throwing away God's Word as revealed in the only Scriptures they had. Or how did the Jews respond to this? they thought that Paul was trying to replace the Old Testament. And what Paul tries to say over and over and over, that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to show you how the Old Testament was actually fulfilled. Okay? And then how did Gentiles respond to this conflict of grace and law? They saw Paul as requiring strict obedience through the Jerusalem Council, which relieved the pressure to become a Jew before becoming a Christian. We talked about that last week. That was the discussion that was had, is if you want to be a Christian, do you first have to be circumcised? Okay? And the Jewish council that met basically said, no, you don't. So the decision was made, you don't have to be circumcised to become a Christian first. Okay? Now, let's wrap it up here with number 4. It says, understanding the tension between grace and law. In the life of a believer, accepting God's grace and obeying God's law follow one another. They are both extremely important. Letter B, the devil works hard to twist, is the word that we're looking for, the truth. Misunderstanding truth causes more harm than ignorance. And he goes on to say, the truth, salvation is by faith through grace. Evidence of salvation ought to be a changed life, which is living in obedience to God's laws. So because of the grace that God has poured out on us, we want to become obedient to Him. That's what they're basically saying, right? That's what we want to do. And then number 5, advanced study of the epistles will yield differences in styles, is the word we're looking for, even among Paul's letters. And then number 6, this is clearly due to the use of different scribes. That's what most scholars think. Different scribes recorded these different letters, and because of that, some of their own style of writing kind of falls into place as these are written down and transcribed. It says scribes were often used in ancient times. Paul dictated most, if not all, of his letters, and a scribe wrote them out, as we said earlier. Okay? And then, what I provided for you, and hopefully this might be helpful, is just a timeline that takes you from Paul's birth, which most people think is in AD 5, okay, or 5 AD, up to, on this particular one, some things that go on with some missionary journeys that he had. And when you flip it over to the very back, or the last page here, make sure I'm getting on the right page. There we go. You know, most people think that he was martyred in 66 AD under the rule of Nero. But then there's another school of thought that says he was able to escape that and possibly made it all the way to Spain or Gaul on a missionary journey as well. Okay? Now let me stop right there. That's week 15. Any questions or comments before we give Carol a chance to come up and do a few announcements for us? Okay. If not, we'll stop right there.